All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to my podcast about air quality. My name is Ean Avila. I'm an intern at County Supervisor John Gioia's office. And today I have a very special guest with me, the man himself, John Gioia.
Ian, how are you? Good to be here.
I'm doing really good. It's a pleasure to meet you.
It's great having you as an intern this summer, and it's a great being able to talk about air quality issues in Richmond.
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity to be here for the podcast. So, apart from being county supervisor, you wear many hats, and one of them is being a board member of BACMed. So, not a lot of people know what BACMed is, so could you please tell the people who aren't that familiar with BACMed what BACMed is and what it does?
Sure. So, I've been a member of the Bay Area Air Quality Management District since 2006, which makes me now the longest serving member on that board, and I was chair of that board about 10 years ago. And the air districts are responsible for regulating what we call stationary sources of air pollution, meaning everything from a dry cleaner to a gas station to a chemical plant to a refinery to a metal melting facility. So we have jurisdiction in regulating the stationary sources of air pollution in all 9 counties in the Bay Area. Now, separate from that, I did serve from 2013 to 2020 on the California Air Resources Board as an appointee of Governor Brown, and that regulates mobile sources of pollution like cars and trucks. But the Air District regulates stationary sources.
Okay. So, I know they've done some work with Chevron, with one of them being Regulation 6, Rule 5. And then up here we have a fact sheet. So if you could please scroll down a little bit.
Right, these are historic
Just scroll
agreements.
down,
Yes.
please. Then show the whole page.
Right,
So, can you scroll a little bit more down? It's like the whole.
there we go. Great.
All right, so here we have some. Can you scroll all the way down when you see the
There we go, that we
there,
can see
okay.
how much we're collecting. Got it.
So I actually have some questions about the funds and the money. So can you walk us through the process that BACMed underwent to agree to these terms? You know, 20 million for past violations, 20 million for the community air fund. Can you walk us through the process?
Sure. So several years ago, we passed a pretty broad-reaching health protective regulation that requires the refineries in the Bay Area to reduce particulate matter from a unit at their refinery. This unit is a unit that is used in making gasoline. And it is the largest source of particulate matter at the refinery, which of course is very hazardous because it gets into our lungs and our bloodstream. And this rule requires refineries to meet a lower threshold of pollution, and it would reduce particulate matter pollution from this major unit by 70%. That's pretty significant because Chevron is the largest source of particulate matter in the Richmond area, that one facility. So this would reduce particulate matter from this unit by 70%. We passed this rule a couple years ago, Rule 6.5. Chevron and Martinez Refinery in Martinez sued us, claiming that we could not pass this regulation. They challenged it in court. Well, after several years, they withdrew their lawsuit. I think they knew they were going to lose, so they withdrew their lawsuit, and we reached a settlement with them, not that we were giving anything up, but because we had a compliance date for meeting Rule 6.5. They have to have this piece of equipment modified, which cost about $500 million to do. And so it's clear they were not going to meet the deadline because they spent their time suing us instead of trying to modify the refinery and comply with our rule. So what we have done here is what this settlement was. We wrapped up a lot of things in one settlement. So the Rule 6.5 noncompliance, which shows here, if they don't meet the compliance deadline, it shows, and they're not going to, they're going to be fined $17 million per year that they don't meet it, and $32 million in year 4. When will they actually meet it? Probably around year 2 or 3. So they're going to end up paying fines for noncompliance. Second, we fined them $20 million for a number of past violations. And then as part of this, we required them to put $20 million in a community air quality fund, and that would go up by $3.5 million per year for every year that they don't comply with the rule. So as you can see, potentially fining them up to $137 million. Now, so far, they are on the hook for $40 million, the air fund and the past violations, and will probably have to pay some of these non-compliance funds. And I can talk a bit about how we're going to spend that money, but that's really what this involves, because we're trying to protect the community. Of course, we'd rather have them comply as soon as possible, because our air would be cleaner if they do that, but if they don't, until they comply, they're going to be fined heavily.
Yeah, so that brings me to my next question. I mean, what would be your vision for the Community Air Quality Fund? Like, where would you want to see that money go to?
Well, first, we want to hear from the community.
Okay.
So I just made a presentation with the Air District to the Richmond City Council last week. We are going to be making presentations to the San Pablo City Council. I know you live in San Pablo. And we're going to be also presenting to the various neighborhood councils in Richmond and to community groups. We want to hear from the public about the process that's going to be used. And then what we will do is put together a grant application to have groups apply for what will be first $40 million and eventually more. So what would be some examples? It could be funding modifications to people's homes to improve indoor air quality, like removing gas appliances and having electric appliances. It could be providing funding to get people to access health care for asthma, for example. It could also be funding other modifications in a school. Like, for example, we're spending $1.5 million to put in air filtration systems in 18 schools in West County. So things that will improve air quality could be tree planting. And things that will improve people's health, and we want to hear from the community about what they value.
So then, well, we know Chevron Refinery, you know, they put out a lot of pollutants into the air. Can you tell us what specific pollutants they put into the air?
Sure. I will start with this. The Air District has been regulating refineries, including Chevron, for some time. So there's always good news and bad news. The good news is, because of these regulations, pollution from the refinery has been going down. The not so good news is it still pollutes, and we need to continue to bring that pollution down. And so there are two types of main pollutants that come from a refinery. Some are what we call toxics, and toxics are the kind of things that they don't travel far, but they affect people who live around the facility, around the refinery. And they are things that get into our lungs and our bloodstream. Particulate matter is one example. And so the toxics can have immediate health impacts to people living near the refinery. Then there's something called criteria pollutants, which affect larger air quality issues in the Bay Area and travel further, also impacting our health. Then there's also what we call greenhouse gas emissions from the refinery. And while they don't impact our health locally, they globally cause climate change and impact our health that way. So think of it as toxics, criteria pollutants. Toxics affect people who live nearby. Criteria pollutants affect people in the broader Bay Area. And then greenhouse gas emissions affect the globe. And so all of those are things that we want to continue to decrease at all the refineries.
Could you please play the video up there, please? So we're going to show you a video, and then, I mean, could you tell us, like, would it be those type of pollutants that would come out? It says the flaring incident.
Tonight at 11, something is burning up, and it looks closer than it seems.
So then, what would be the health effects that people in that area would have, maybe short-term or long-term?
So, and that looks like an example of flaring, and I'll talk about what flaring is, because we're working on some new rules to reduce flaring. So what happens, this is really important, I'm glad you raised flaring, is, you know, a refinery is under pressure. Think of it as a high-pressure operation. And if there is an upset in their process, and something's going to go wrong, they flare. in order to prevent the pressure from building. And when they flare, the emissions don't go through the normal emissions control. They just get released into the air, which is a bad thing.
Yeah.
And while it avoids something more major from happening by flaring, we have rules to really minimize flaring, but Chevron has been flaring in the last couple of years more frequently than it had in the past, and they've been fined for it and will continue to be fined, and we're working on a new rule. But in the flaring, a lot of that is like sulfur, and it smells like rotten eggs.
Yeah.
For those of us who grew up in this area, we probably would smell this more in the past. It's that rotten egg smell, which is the sulfur. And it damaged all of this, all exposure to all of this over long periods of time, according to our health officer, can have cardiovascular impacts, obviously impacts on asthma, but also impact your lungs, your heart, your circulatory system when you have continued exposure. And that is why we are continuing to regulate flaring. Refineries used to flare a lot more before. Now they flare only in emergencies.
Okay.
And so what we're concerned about is what was the emergency that caused them to flare? Because that's what we're trying to get at, and telling them you need to fix the underlying problem that caused the flaring. And an example was this is an unfortunate thing. A few years ago, they built a new hydrogen plant, and at the refinery, and the hydrogen plant was near some power lines at the refinery. And so the effect of this hydrogen plant being too near these power lines caused inconsistent power and some power outages. And when you have a power outage at a refinery, you have an upset in your system, and that caused them to flare a lot. And they flared for about 6 months while they were trying to fix the problem. So the flaring from that went away once they fixed the problem of the hydrogen plant impacting the power line. So that's an example where it's about getting to the underlying problem, but Chevron has had some flaring in the last few years and been heavily fined for it. That was part of the $20 million past violations.
So then, I mean, what do you say to the people that say, 20 million is nothing, it's our health, 20 million for this is nothing, they keep doing it? What do you say to them?
I agree. I grew up. I live in Richmond. I grew up here. There is no cost that our health doesn't come at a cost, right? We have a right to breathe clean air. Everyone has that right here, and which is why our major goal is getting the flaring to stop or be substantially reduced and be minor when they really have to do it for an emergency, and now because a $20 million fine, again, Chevron, while it may sound like a lot of money, really isn't to a big oil company like that. And we would rather have them not flare than to have to fine. Now, we often like to fine more, but there are maximum fines and penalties under state law that we can impose. Every year for the past few years, we sponsored a bill in the California legislature to raise the maximum fines. And every year, up until this last year, business and industry fought the bill, and the bill died and didn't pass. Right?
Yeah.
So fortunately, our Assembly member Buffy Wicks carried a bill that did pass that increases the maximum fines we can impose, which is good because ultimately you want the fines to be large enough to be a disincentive on the refinery. Now, I think they are committed to try to be safe, but they make mistakes.
Yeah.
Some of those mistakes are preventable, and that's what we are most concerned about, is preventing those preventable mistakes. And so it's not just about the regulation, but it's about also requiring better safety at a facility. And Contra Costa County has a local ordinance that does regulate safety at the refineries, where we go in and inspect and require them to go through their whole process. And just like an airplane. You know, when you fly an airplane, mistakes are deadly and fatal, and they do a lot of redundancy. So we require refineries to go through their whole process and look at where they can reduce risks. And for example, I don't know if you remember, you were young at the time, the 2012 Chevron fire. There was a fire, you were very young at the time, the 2012 Chevron fire. And we did a big investigation into that, and we found what caused that fire was they had some pipe, and the pipe had corroded. And so the corrosion caused a leak, and when the firefighters went in and were poking around and looking at the leak, the pipe actually broke through, and that's what caused the fire. So what did we learn from that? They needed to use more corrosive resistant metal, like a stainless steel kind of thing, so that the metal pipes would not corrode as fast. And so that is what came out of that, is saying you have to use the most appropriate type of metal for the pipes, in this case, something that was more corrosion resistant.
So, I mean, do you see like a realistic future where Chevron is just not existent, where Chevron just packs up its things and leaves, and there's not a refinery in Richmond anymore?
I think that will eventually happen. The question is how fast. So, and the past may sort of inform us about what's going to happen. So when I was on the California Air Resources Board, we passed a lot of rules that move us toward electrification of our transportation system, moving away from fossil fuels like electric cars, things like that, right? So over time, Californians will become less reliant on fossil fuels as more people buy electric cars. And we passed a rule, in fact, that requires transit buses, all new transit buses starting in 2029 to be non-polluting electric. There's rules on trucks and cars. So what's happened so far, there were 5 refineries in the Bay Area, 4 in Contra Costa and 1 in Benicia in Solano County. 2 of the ones in Contra Costa stopped refining crude oil and shifted to refining like soybean oil and animal fat to create renewable diesel. So less pollution, about half the pollution comes out of those refineries by refining soybean oil instead of crude oil, but still pollution, but half. And then the refinery in Benicia announced it was going to close next year. So that will leave only 2 refineries here in the Bay Area that refine crude oil, one in Martinez and then Chevron. And so that means less gasoline produced. And I think that's both responding to what's happening in the market, but also the shifts of where the energy economy is taking us. So think of it, you'll have 4 refineries left, 2 that manufacture renewable fuels from soybean oil, 2 that refine crude oil into gasoline. And then eventually, in the future, as we transition more away from fossil fuel internal combustion engines, I think we will eventually not have a refinery. But I think that day for Chevron is probably off in the future by some time, because the transition to zero emission electric takes decades, right? Because you're still going to have internal combustion engines on the road and trucks as well. And so you're still going to have liquid fuel, but so I think it'll come over time.
Is there like any major pushback that you get from people that support the refinery? Like, what do they tell you when you're putting these regulations? You're telling them they got to stop doing this. What do you hear from them?
That is also a factor. I'm glad you mentioned that. There are a lot of people who are concerned about the price of gasoline. So when you have less refineries, and you do now have less refineries in California, you're producing less gasoline for the California market. And if you look at supply and demand, it means that the supply is going down potentially faster than the demand is going down, and which raises the price of gas. And so what you're seeing now, the oil industry, the refinery industry is putting out a lot of media saying that the policies of California are raising the price of gasoline. And that is true. They are. I think it's part of this transition that we're in. So I think we're all trying to be conscious of, I mean, there are still cars, there are obviously cars on the road. In fact, last year, I think earlier this year, the most recent quarter, 20% of all the new cars purchased were electric cars. Not you, but of new.
Yeah.
So we're seeing that shift happen, but it's going to happen over decades, not overnight. So there's still going to be the need for gasoline. And so that's the tension we're at. How do we move us into this new green energy economy away from fossil fuels without doing it in a way that raises the cost of fuel so it's unaffordable for many Californians, especially lower and middle income residents. And we're seeing that begin to happen now. The other, Contra, Costa, and Los Angeles are the two counties in the state that have the largest number of refineries. And the Valero refinery in Benicia announced closing its refinery here. There's also a closure of a refinery in Los Angeles. So we're seeing already less refineries. Right now, pretty much only refineries in California make gasoline for the California market because, for two reasons. One is the fuel requirements in California are different than other states because the whole purpose is to reduce air pollution. So we have a different mix of fuel. So pretty much only California refineries make gasoline for the market. Second, there's no real way to bring in gasoline by pipeline from other states. You'd have to bring it in by tanker, and that's expensive. So we're sort of isolated as a market. So what happens is when California refineries close, it's not necessarily replaced by refineries making gasoline for us from other states, which of course raises the price of gasoline. So that is something we're all conscious of. The California Energy Commission's looking at that, and there is pushback about that cost. And so California is trying to move in a way to balance all of this.
So then how do you convince your average person, right, low income, has two jobs, has gas-powered cars, old-powered cars, and then how do you convince them to switch to electric when they say, well, my gas-powered car, even though I pay a little bit more for gas, it gets me to where I got to go, I don't got to charge it. What do you say to them?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. So the cost of a new electric car is higher generally than the cost of a new gasoline internal combustion engine car. However, the maintenance and fuel costs long term for an electric car are less expensive than a gasoline car. But what's important to people is what they pay up front, right? And I'm going to talk about this with regard to trucks in a second. So I think we need to, the state, all of us collectively need to do a better job to look at how this transition occurs in a way that's affordable. There were a lot of subsidies and incentives to people to buy electric cars, but the federal government now, in the Trump administration, is ending these incentives because they're trying to slow down our transition to electric cars. They want us to rely on polluting fossil fuels, which long-term for the planet we need to address because of climate change. But we're also up against, as you so accurately mentioned, how do we do this in a way to not affect people's pocketbooks? And because it has. So I think the subsidies have helped. Many of them are going away. Here's where I think the future lies. As electric vehicles become more common and technology improves, they're becoming less expensive. And it is estimated that in a few years, they will be similar in cost. They aren't today, but will be similar in cost to gasoline cars. As I said, if you look at fuel and maintenance, so for a trucking company, for example, when we required FedEx to have electric trucks at a new warehouse in North Richmond, what FedEx looked at, they look at four things in the cost of trucks. How much it costs to buy the truck up front, what does it cost to maintain it, what's the fuel and what's the labor cost. And guess what? Over 10 years, that cost was less for electric trucks than diesel trucks, because labor was the same, but fuel and maintenance were less, upfront capital costs more. So what FedEx doesn't care about the upfront cost, they care about the life cycle cost over 10 years. So in that case, we're seeing trucking companies begin to switch to electric vehicles because of the 10-year cost is less. But for a car, people are looking at what they can afford to buy. And until I think the prices come down, and they are, and it's going to take time. And so that is why the state looks at a transition. So combination of subsidies, incentives, and technology pushing the cost down. And I'm certain they will. The question is it's not fast enough, and that's why the transitions takes longer, and why I think this has very much an equity issue, frankly. Lower income residents aren't benefiting from this switch as much. That's why I'm a believer that we need to have more incentives and subsidies based on income for people that buy electric vehicles.
So then, while I want to talk about clean energy, do you have like a main clean energy option that you like, that you really support? Because we know wind turbines, they're good, but then they kill birds. Solar panels, lithium mining. So there's like pros and cons. Is there like any alternative energy source that you really champion?
All of the above we're looking at. I think we're in this I sort of compare the time we're in now to the Industrial Revolution back in the 1800s, when we shifted from, manual labor and manufacturing to industrialization. It was a time of a lot of uncertainty and a lot of new technologies and a lot of fear and a lot of just change, which is what we're going through now. I think everyone realizes we need to move away from fossil fuels for the health of the planet, for our own health, but that the cost of this transition is going to impact people. And so I think the problem we have is that it's California pretty much on its own doing a lot of this without the federal government, especially in the new Trump administration. You really need strong federal subsidies and policies to continue to invest in alternative clean energy. And the federal government is their new tax bill removes a lot of the incentives and money for clean energy, which is unfortunate, because technology is changing. It's already identified. Look, if you look at electric cars, my first electric car was in 2013. It was a Leaf. It got 70 miles of range. My current Leaf gets 230 miles of range. And the car actually costs the same pretty much as it did 13 years ago. So you're seeing the technology improve, and things become more affordable. And whether it's wind, solar, hydrogen, there's a lot of promising things that are going to take time and will also take investment. And I think what's happening is we're moving in that direction, and it needs to be aligned with how we're moving away from fossil fuel. It's not totally aligned, including about jobs. So there's no easy answers here. I think this is a real life situation we're in. And you have the oil industry trying to remove incentives for clean energy. Although what they're doing, and I've talked to oil companies about this, they're beginning as well to start investing in these areas if they think they're going to make money in this. Like the reason they shifted from refining crude oil to soybean oil is there were state and federal incentives to do that, and they thought, well, we can make renewable diesel or aviation fuel. So if they see value for their shareholders, they start to invest in that. So that's what we're seeing, and it's going to continue to be a bumpy road.
So what can the community do to help? What can the average person do to help fight air pollution?
I think one is to speak out first about the negative impacts about air pollution on their health. And when there are local government decisions, whether it's at a city, a county, air district, is to support those things, to help empower decision makers to make those decisions. I mean, we look at the cost of complying with our regulations. We do consider those things. So I think, but it is important for the public to tell their own stories about their impacts on their health, and to advocate for that when decisions are made. And I think to advocate for incentives based upon people's income. So can I give you an example?
Yeah, I was about to ask you that, yeah.
So I want to give an example of something that's real. So the Air District has developed a rule to require water heaters in the Bay Area, 9 counties, to require new water heaters starting in the end of 2027 to be what are called non-polluting zero NOx water heaters. Basically means no gas water heaters, and being electric heat pump, which are much more efficient but cost more today. So the struggle that we have, and I talk about this a lot, is how do we do this in a way so that lower income residents can afford that shift? Because at an Air District meeting, we had folks from Palo Alto, wealthy community, saying, we need to do this right away. We're doing it in Palo Alto. My response is, fine, Palo Alto, high income residents, you can afford it. I represent people in Richmond and San Pablo. How do we help them buy this more expensive water heater? Yes, it's cheaper to operate. The energy costs are less over 10 years, but they can't afford to pay, let's say, $1,500 for a water heater, whereas they may have paid $300 before. So what we're trying to do is align this rule with funding opportunities to subsidize folks. So that's the difference between environmental justice and environmental. Environmental folks from Palo Alto will say, we care about the environment, we need to do this quickly. Environmental justice advocates say, yes, it's about the environment, but it's also about justice issues of, and social equity issues in our community. So we're dealing with this now at the Air District, and the federal government's taking away a lot of the federal incentives that existed for these shifts to electric heat pump. They're more because it's more expensive to buy.
So is there any incentive for electric cars right now?
So there are some incentives now. They're not as much as they used to be. And I think what the federal government has said, so here's sort of the inconsistency. Under federal tax law, there's a lot of incentives to oil companies, subsidies, incentives. But as soon as there's an incentive for electric vehicles, the more conservative members of Congress say, well, we want to take away the incentives for electric vehicles because that technology should exist on its own without any subsidies. Let the market grow the electric vehicle industry. And my response is, well, you've got subsidies for oil companies. What's wrong with having some reasonable subsidies to move toward electric vehicles? So this is the political divide and the hypocrisy in a way that exists is it's okay to have subsidies for the oil industry, but not for electric cars. Now, Elon Musk of Tesla actually did want to keep some of the electric vehicle subsidies, right? Because he owns Tesla. But the Trump administration decided not to continue them.
All right. Well, do you have any final message to anyone watching this, really passionate about air quality? Any final things to say?
Well, all the questions you asked really go to the heart of all the debates that are going on right now. And as you can tell by my answers, there's no one easy answer to all of this. And it's complicated, and ultimately the goal, I think, is to try to move this incrementally in a way that is affordable for people, that keeps making progress. And that means we may not go as fast as some people want us to go, and we may be moving slower than what some people want us to do. So it's a bit of both. The oil companies want us to go really slow, and a lot of really strong environmental groups want us to go faster. Whereas I think folks in the environmental justice who consider their income and their impacts on their life, like in the Central Valley, understand that it's a complex issue. And I think people in Richmond are in that, a lot of that are in that situation. It's like they want to be part of the benefits of clean energy because, and I think, you know, communities like Richmond have been on the front lines of the pollution impacts. So now they need to be on the front lines of the benefits. And it's not fair to communities like ours not to be on the front lines of the benefit when we've been on the front lines of getting all the negative impacts.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for those questions.
Great. Yeah,
really great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good.